If nothing else, this talk fits in nicely with the very first chorus. So, great minds think alike, eh? My Father's House is the title, and this is a famous passage from Scripture, but I just want to look at it this morning. That comes from John chapter 14, verses 2 and 3, and this will probably be a familiar passage to you. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. If you've got that in the King James, it will say, my Father's house has many mansions. So if you're looking for a mansion, then you'll have to go with the King James version. If you just want a room, the NIV. And I was sort of reflecting on this passage. And it says here, I think the rooms or dwelling places is a far better translation. Mansions just doesn't really make a lot of sense. But Jesus says here that I'm going to prepare a place for you. And I thought, well, the traditional view on this is that Jesus is going to heaven and is spending, well, at least 2,000 years going strong, doing some interior design and some building work. Now, I know Jesus was a carpenter, but 2,000 years on a building job is a bit excessive. I just thought to myself, well, is that what the Lord is doing? Is he spending all this time preparing a place in heaven for us? It's a bit of a waste of time, I thought, The creator of the universe, who can do so much in 6 days, is that what he's doing now? Preparing a place in heaven for us. And one day will come to us and take us to himself to be where he is. And that's the view that I had when I was growing up. And this is a view that other commentators have, that this is talking about heaven. My Father's house has many rooms, and I'm going there to prepare a place for you. I'm going up to heaven. This is just prior to the crucifixion and his resurrection. I'm going to heaven. I'm going to prepare a place for you, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to take you to myself. And, well, as I say, it's 2,000 years and still going strong. Well, is this what Jesus is talking about here? And it got me thinking. And there are 2 problems with this view in these verses, and I want to address both of them. So if we go to the next slide, problem 1 is the place being spoken of. And Jesus says, in my Father's house are many rooms, and I'm going there to prepare a place for you. Well, if you look through the Bible, the phrase Father's house, Father's place, never ever refers to heaven. It's never used that way. But it is used in a particular way, and John uses it himself earlier on in his gospel. Now, John, if he's using that phrase, would be consistent within his own letter in terminology. So if we go to John chapter 2, and we read from verses 13 onwards, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found people selling cattle, sheep and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So he's in Jerusalem and he's in the temple, and he sees the money changers, the people selling, marketeers, and gets very annoyed at this. And so if we continue, next slide. To those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. his disciples remember that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. Notice here, John is equating my Father's house, and Jesus' own words say this, with the temple. So, if we go to the next slide, there's just several things to notice about this these verses. Jesus mentions, stop turning my Father's house, which is the temple, because that's where he is, into a market. And then his disciples remembered something that was written in the Psalms, zeal for your house will consume me. And that comes from Psalm 69, verses 8 and 9. And that particular psalm is a messianic prophetic psalm. It's very much about the Lord. And as you can see, when it says in Psalm 69, 8 and 9, I am a foreigner to my own family. Well, Jesus was a foreigner to his own family. They didn't understand him. They didn't get him. A stranger to my own mother's children, his brothers and sisters. And it goes on, for zeal for your house consumes me. And the insults of those who insult you fall on me. Jesus was very heavily insulted. You know, on the build up to the crucifixion, the insults were flying left, right and centre. But it's the middle bit, zeal for your house consumes me. So Jesus has equated my Father's house with the temple. And that's quite clear in John chapter 2. So if we go back to John chapter 14, 2 and 3. Here, when Jesus is referring to my Father's house, I believe he's referring to the temple. He's not referring to heaven at all. So that's the first problem in my mind out of the way, that you have to change what these verses relate to. They're not relating to heaven. It's not, Jesus hasn't gone into heaven to prepare a place. He's talking about the temple. And the temple at the time of Jesus, Herod's temple, was a magnificent structure. But it was laid out in a particular way. And I want to look at the way the temple at that time was laid out, a particular part of it. But you have to go all the way back. Because if you go back to when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, on their journey on the way to the promised land, they went through the desert and all that, God gave Moses instructions about how to build a tabernacle. And this was a portable place, because they were nomadic at that point in time. It had to be portable. So what they would do is they would travel to a place. The Lord would say, will you stop here for a while? They would unravel. They would get this portable tabernacle out. They would erect it. And the thing about the tabernacle is, and there's quite a lot, you'll have to read about it for yourself, but the thing is, it was a place where the glory of God resided. And that was quite an important aspect of it. The glory of God resided amongst human beings. It resided in the tabernacle. When they then entered the promised land, they still had the tabernacle that was used for some time. But when David came to the throne, he had it on his heart to build a permanent dwelling place for God. He wanted to build a proper temple. God would not allow David to build the temple. God said to David, you're a man of war. The person who builds a temple must be a man of peace. And the person who was the man of peace was actually Solomon, who was David's son. Solomon became king. David had been given instructions by God as to how to build the temple. David passed these instructions on to Solomon, and Solomon, when he came to power, then did build the temple, and you have what's called Solomon's temple. And that lasted for many years, but through one thing and another, that eventually was destroyed. But then, as I say, the temple was rebuilt, and that's what you have, Herod's temple. And Herod's temple is the one that Jesus would have frequented. He would have gone into the courts, he would have taught there. But if you look at the tabernacle, if you look at Solomon's temple, or you look at Herod's temple, there is something unique something that is unique to all three of them. There are many differences about them, but there is something that was common to all of them, And it's this commonality I want to look at this morning. Because Jesus has said, in my Father's house, and I believe it relates to the tabernacle, the temple, are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you in that temple, in that tabernacle. He is talking spiritually, but I believe you have to look at the sort of the material tabernacle and temple to see how it was constructed, how it was based on the plans that God had given Moses and David, and see what happens through the years. And if you see the symbolism, you can then get an idea of what Jesus came to do and why he could say, in my Father's house are many rooms, and I go to prepare it for you. So, we go to the next slide. There, within, whether it's the tabernacle or the temple, you will find a construction. And it's always constructed that way. There's a room called the Holy of Holies. It's always a square. There's a room called the Holy Place. It's longer than the Holy of Holies. I think it's about twice the length, same width. But the thing to note is there is a dividing curtain that separates the Holy of Holies from the Holy Place. That curtain is extremely important. So Holy of Holies, Holy Place, and a dividing curtain. Let me go to the next slide. The thing about the Holy of Holies is it housed the Ark of the Covenant. And it's recorded in several places in Scripture that the glory of God descends once the tabernacle or the temple has been completed, descends above the Ark of the Covenant. And it's a radiant, bright light. It is extremely bright. And this light, this glory of God, would have filled the Holy of Holies. But there was a curtain that stopped the glory of God filling the holy place. That is important. Now, various people could do various things within the holy place and the Holy of Holies. So we go to the next slide. The priests, the ordinary priests, could enter the holy place, and they did that on a daily basis. They did it to tend the candlesticks, to keep the light going. They put the showbread onto the table. Various things like that were done on a daily basis. So the priests could enter that section. There was only one person who could enter the Holy of Holies, and he could only do it once a year on the Day of Atonement, and that was the high priest. So the high priest was the only person who had access to the Ark of the Covenant and the glory of God. One person could, having gone through all the ritual of cleansing, he had to put the particular high priest garments on. Once he'd done all that, he could then enter the Holy of Holies. But as I say, he could only do it on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. So the thing to notice about this is that priests can enter this particular structure. It's purely for priests. Common people couldn't do it. There are records in the Bible of people attempting to enter wrongly and suffering for it. I think it's recorded King Saul did it, one of them, but dreadful things happened. As I say, the tabernacle, Solomon's temple and Herod's temple had this layout. Then we come to Jesus' crucifixion. So we go to the next slide. What happened at Jesus' crucifixion? Well, the very important thing happened. The curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place was rent in two. It was split. And the thing is, once it was split by Jesus' crucifixion, effectively the barrier between the Holy of Holies and the holy place no longer exists. It's gone. And Jesus' crucifixion accomplished that. And that's recorded. The curtain was rent in two. It was rent from top to bottom. Top to bottom is significant because it means it's going from heaven to earth, God to man. And so now you've got the question, well, what happens to the glory of God? When we go to the next slide, given how bright that light is, the glory of God now has to fill that whole area. So the whole of that structure, because of the work of Christ, now allows the glory of God to fill the whole place. So the glory of God has filled it. Now remember, there are two parts to this, the Holy of Holies and the holy place. Well, what's that place now called? Is it the Holy of Holies or is it the holy place? I would say, and if you go to the next slide, it's now all become the Holy of Holies, because the glory of God has spread into the other area and therefore has made it all the Holy of Holies. But remember, only priests can go into this section. So if we go to the next slide, notice what can happen now. If ordinary priests go into the section that they're entitled to go into, because of what's happened through Christ's crucifixion, they can legitimately enter that bottom part, but notice it has now all become the Holy of Holies. They rightfully, because of what Christ has done, the priests, the common priests, can now enter into this whole glory of God. It's open to them. It has been opened to them by God. That is tremendous. That is wonderful. But I just want to show you, because remember, I'm talking about my Father's house, the temple having many rooms. Jesus saying, I'm going to make a dwelling place for you. I'm going to give you access to this. Remember that only priests can access it. Well, if we go to 1 Peter, which is the next slide, 1 Peter 2, 4 and 5, Peter writes this, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. But if we go to the next slide, the two bits that are highlighted, it's now a spiritual house. The tabernacle and the temple, the layout, the way it was laid out, and it was all done in materials, but it was symbolic. It was a physical place. Now what's being talked about is a spiritual place. But notice it is a spiritual house. But notice also what Peter says, that we, like living stones, believers, are now a holy priesthood. We have become priests. Priests have access to the Holy of Holies through the work of what Jesus has done. That means we have access to the glory of God. We can dwell in the presence of the glory of God. May not feel like it sometimes, but it doesn't stop it being true that we have access to the glory of God. I know Brian has spoken about doxa, which is glory. Much more can be said on that. But you see, this is what Jesus was talking about. He wasn't talking about going to heaven to create a dwelling place for us there. He was talking about, what I'm going to do is I'm going to establish a spiritual temple, spiritual dwelling place for my children. But if you understood, and the Jews would have done that, they would have understood the tabernacle, the symbolism of the tabernacle and the temple. You have to understand the symbolism. You have to understand what Jesus did. And once you've got the symbolism, you can now translate that into the spiritual realm. And you can see what has been accomplished. So my belief is that when Jesus says, my Father's house has many rooms, he's talking about the spiritual temple. He's equating it with the temple. His disciples would have known the temple. They would have walked in Herod's temple. They would have known the layout. They would have known they had no access to the inner chambers. That was purely for the priests. So he's not talking about something that was alien to them. He was talking something to the Jews, to his Jewish disciples, who knew tabernacle and temple intimately. But he's saying, I'm going to prepare the spiritual place for you. You can dwell there. You will have access to the glory of God. You will have access to the Holy of Holies. You will be able to live in the presence of God. You will be able to encounter the glory of God in a way that has never before been possible. Because of my work, I'm going to tear the curtain in half. And because of my work, you're going to become a priesthood. You're going to become priests. Revelation 1 talks about that, talks about us being a kingdom of priests. We become priests. And therefore have legitimate access to the house of God, to the temple, the spiritual temple. So I don't think Jesus was talking about heaven whatsoever. I think he was talking about what he was going to do for us now. It's interesting if you start looking at sort of passages that occur in the Bible about the house of the Lord, the house of God. It's never referred to as my Father's house in the Old Testament. That's a New Testament concept. But in the Old Testament, you do have this concept of the house of God. You have it in the physical tabernacle and temple, but you also have it in particular passages in the Bible, in the Old Testament. This is a very well-known one, but I just bring it to your attention. It comes from Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. You will know that one. But the very last verse says, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, what was David talking about? He wasn't a priest. He was a king. Kings had no right of access to the inner core of the temple. Only priests could. So what was he talking about? I believe he was sort of seeing what was going to happen. You know, that there would come a point in time where he could dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He could dwell in the glory of God. He could dwell in the presence of God. He would have the right to do that. But the thing about the temple and the tabernacle, it's here on earth. It's not heaven. It's earth. The location, I believe, that Jesus was talking about isn't up there or wherever heaven is. He's talking about here on earth. This can be backed up if you look at Revelation 21. Because look at this. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Notice the location. Here on earth. And that is specifically stated there. It comes from heaven and it comes to earth. God's work, the Lord's work, is all to do with this planet. And it's a mistake to say, well, no, things are happening in heaven. It's up there. I believe that what Jesus is talking about is down here. This is what's down here. And I thought to myself, well, where does house of God first occur in the Bible? Brian has spoken about the concept of first occurrence. When a phrase is introduced in the Bible, often there's something about it of significance, so it's very first mention. Well, let's go back to Genesis. So we go back to Genesis 28. And this is to do with Jacob. Jacob has basically had a big falling out with his brother and has had to leave. So he's left and he's travelling, I think, northeast to find a wife for himself and find somewhere to settle. But Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Go to the next slide. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So that's not just Jews, that's Gentiles as well. And your offspring. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. It's a tremendous promise to Jacob of what he would do. But notice what Jacob says. Let me go to the next slide. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. So we go to the next slide. It's highlighted. That particular phrase, notice what Jacob says. This is none other than the house of God. Where is the house of God? Well, it's standing on it. It's on the earth, the house of God. And this is the gate of heaven. I think there's probably a lot in that, but I don't know what it is. But it's just the fact that house of God, this is the first time house of God is referred to. And it comes out of the mouth of Jacob. He says, the place where I am is the house of God. Terrestrial, here on earth, not up there. Because he says, well, this is the gate of heaven, but the house of God is here. And interesting enough, he renames the place Bethel. If you know that, Beth is house, and El is a shortened form of God. Bethel is house of God on the earth. You see, the trouble we take in Jesus' statement in John 14, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and thinking it's heaven, is it puts it out there somewhere, out of reach. When Jesus is referring to the earth, the temple on earth, it brings it here, into the here, down here. And if we go to the next slide, the second problem, I think, with saying that my Father's house, when Jesus is talking about that, is in heaven, what then happens, if you say it's heaven, you put it into the future. I'm going to prepare a place for you, and immediately you think, well, it's in heaven. Well, it'll be in the future when he comes to collect me. It's in the future. If you start talking about it in terms of it being the temple, it immediately comes into the here and now. It's present. And I think that's what Jesus was talking about. He said he was going to prepare a spiritual place where we as priests could encounter the glory of God, experience all that meant, but it would also be in the here and now. Jesus' crucifixion tore the curtain in two, made us into priests. And when it says he comes back to collect us, I believe that's more in a spiritual sense. But you see, that's a tremendous verse. If we go to the next slide, and this is where we started. My Father's house has many rooms. Wonderfully, it has many dwelling places. Many people can fit in there. He's going to prepare it for us. Well, it took the crucifixion and resurrection to prepare. The crucifixion rent the curtain in two. And I will come back and take you to be with me. And there are many places in the New Testament where it talks about us now being with Christ and being with the Father. And you will see that in Ephesians. Because in chapter 2, in Ephesians, it talks about us being raised with Christ and seated with God in the heavenly realms in Christ. That talks about heaven in the sense that the heavenly realms, but I think we make a mistake when we put it up there and into the future. What we have to do is do what Jacob did, in the sense, this is the house of God. It's here and now. And we can dwell in it. We have this tremendous glory of God around us and in us. And that can be backed up by many other passages in the New Testament. But I just want to say, I think my Father's house is talking about the temple. It's not talking about heaven. It's talking about the here and now. Amen.